Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of All Things Policy, the daily podcast from Takshashila that takes a deep dive into innovative policy developments. My name is Maya, and I'm an assistant program manager here at the Takshashila Institution. I help manage and deliver our postgraduate program in public policy, our 48-week flagship program that is specifically tailored for those looking to explore both the practical aspects of public policy. I'm joined here today with Aparna, and I'll let her go ahead and introduce herself quickly.
Hi everyone. Hi Maya. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm Aparna and I'm part of the policy school at Takshashila, and I'm really happy to join Maya in today's conversation.
Thanks, Aparna, for that. In today's episode, we're going to explore how urban spaces and the city can be designed to be more inclusive and accessible for women. Essentially, we're looking at how gender-responsive urban design can be considered and implemented properly in an Indian context. Before we really get into maybe the nitty-gritty of it, I just want to paint you a picture. So it's late evening in Mumbai, and Asha, a young working professional, has just finished her workday. She had to stay back late in the office to finish an important project. She's feeling really tired. And as the office clears out, she heads to the nearest bus stop, hoping to catch a ride home. But the moment she steps outside, a sense of unease creeps in. The bus stop is poorly lit by a single streetlight that barely cuts through the darkness and is completely deserted. She considers taking an Uber or an Ola, but it's far too expensive. She grits her teeth and decides to take her chances, making sure to send her friend her location on WhatsApp. Now imagine this. Her colleague Ravi, a young professional walking to the exact same bus stop, faces none of these concerns. For him, the same bus stop feels brightly lit, the streets seem bustling with pedestrians. It's a normal evening in the big city. What exactly does Asha's experience tell us about the built environment and how it's designed? Gender-responsive urban design, which is designing cities and spaces with the needs of everyone in mind, especially marginalized groups like women, is what is key here. Asha's fear of walking alone at night isn't just about her perception of safety. It's about the lack of infrastructure that considers her unique experience as a woman. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that gender-responsive urban design is important because it addresses these inequities. It involves lots of factors, such as considering well-lit streets, safer pedestrian routes, thinking about making transport more accessible, thinking about redesigning public spaces to accommodate women's specific vulnerabilities and unique needs. So in Asha's case, the polylit bus stop and the lack of safe pathways aren't just an inconvenience, they're a deterrent that limit her autonomy and her ability to succeed at work. Without gender-sensitive planning, these invisible barriers remain unaddressed. So if Asha's environment had been designed with her safety and comfort in mind, perhaps she wouldn't have felt that hesitation the next time her boss asked her to stay late.
I completely agree with you, Maya. So, traditionally, cities have been designed with a neutral perspective, which often defaults to the experiences of men. The way we design our cities impacts the way we move, live, and thrive within them. Yet, for decades, urban planning has been based off on a one size fits all approach that usually defaults to a male perspective, with the assumption being that everyone moves through the city in the same way. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The way people move through cities, people access public spaces, and experience safety differs significantly based on gender. And India, which is a country that's rapidly urbanizing, I think it's essential to ensure that development doesn't exasperate the existing gender disparities, but instead promotes gender equality and empowers all citizens to fully participate in urban life. While my lived experiences kind of help me understand this issue to a certain extent, my question now is, how do these urban design elements hinder women's mobility, safety, and participation in public life?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I think something that comes to my mind at the forefront, especially in an Indian context, is the lack of a comprehensive and safe public transport system. The way people move and navigate through cities is highly gendered. Women do tend to rely more on public transportation, while men are more likely to use private vehicles, bicycles, or motorcycles. And interestingly, women are also more likely to walk and tend to travel more than men during off peak hours. Additionally, women tend to take multiple short trips throughout the day. This is called trip chaining, and it refers to traveling for multiple different purposes, whether it's commuting to work, dropping children off at school, or buying groceries. And women tend to do this more because of essentially what's called the care economy and the care work they have to do and sort of the invisible labor they have to do in addition to their professional responsibilities. When you look at men, on the other hand, they tend to travel often during peak hours and undertake a single long trip in the morning and the evening, usually to and from work. So during those 9 to 5 hours. However, many Indian cities are not built to accommodate the patterns that women have. There's also the very obvious issue of safety. Harassment in public transport and on the streets is a major concern, and this directly affects how and when women use these spaces. So much of the news I read and that I see in the media, online, on Instagram, in news outlets, on TV, so many of these tragic news and horror stories of women getting sexually assaulted occur on public transportation, and this almost acts as a warning and a deterrent for other women. So you can see that this has real economic, social, and behavioral consequences as well as psychological consequences. If a woman doesn't feel safe taking a bus home at night, she may avoid job opportunities that require late shifts. Likewise, if a girl doesn't feel safe taking a bus home at night, she may avoid going for the evening tuition classes. And it's not just about safety. There are also issues with poor street design as a whole. Streets are often poorly lit, sidewalks are inadequate or non existent, there are limited seating areas at transit spaces, and there's no consideration for women's needs, like perhaps having adequate facilities for women, maybe clean restrooms, and childcare spaces in public areas like parks and other recreational areas.
No, that's very interesting. But I really wonder if, like, we have all of these challenges, but what are some policy interventions that have been successfully implemented in other cities across the world? Because I'm sure this isn't an individual problem for a specific country. So, yeah, do you know of any such policy interventions?
Definitely. There are lots of great best practices across the globe that India could perhaps sort of cherry pick and maybe take some inspiration from. The first, maybe we could start with Vienna, Austria. They were one of the first to introduce gender audits to evaluate the safety of public spaces. Essentially, a gender audit looks at the way different genders experience public spaces. And it identifies safety blind spots where women might feel especially unsafe. It also takes into account things we mentioned before, such as lighting, transport, and accessibility. And they also use the concept of passive surveillance, the informal surveillance that naturally occurs when these spaces are well lit and regularly used and are visible by many people. Women automatically feel safer because there's a sense of accountability and a sense of not being so isolated in their urban space.
That's a really proactive way to assess urban spaces and design them better. I also heard that there are other things that Vienna does to ensure that public spaces, urban public spaces, are more inclusive. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, so Vienna also introduced real-time GPS tracking for public transport systems. They made it easier to know where buses and trams are at any given time, and they've also installed panic buttons on transport systems. This makes a huge difference because in an emergency, women can quickly alert authorities and get assistance. And they've also made public transport safer by increasing the number of security personnel during peak hours, particularly in areas that are known to have higher incidence of harassment. So I think the great thing about Vienna's approach is that it's very targeted, it's very specific, and it's very strategic. And I think India could definitely learn from some of these practices.
Completely agree. I totally love the idea of panic buttons, something that we should definitely learn from. But I wonder, are there any other best practices from around the world that you think that we can implement?
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about Bogota, Colombia. This city has made significant strides in creating safer public transport options for women, particularly in the response to high levels of sexual harassment. The city implemented several targeted measures aimed at addressing gendered mobility patterns and enhancing the safety of female commuters. In 2014, the city introduced women only sections in its public transport Transmilenio buses, which are specifically designed to provide a safer environment for female passengers during peak hours, as well as women only bus stops. In Barcelona, as another example, they've implemented super blocks, a model whose urban areas are designed to prioritize pedestrians and cyclists over cars. And this model encourages mixed use spaces where people live, work, and socialize, a form of urban design that is particularly beneficial for women. And in fact, at our Takshashila office, which is located on Church Street, we sort of see this mixed block kind of approach where cars aren't really allowed to enter and it's more of a pedestrian space. There are more community spaces. And if you come to Church Street, you can really see that there are a lot of women walking around, and you can tell they feel safe. You can tell they feel comfortable. You can see them hailing rickshaws. And I think this is a really good example here in Bangalore of a mixed use space. Another international example is in Stockholm, Sweden, which has actually prioritized snow removal from pedestrian paths before roads, recognizing that more women than men travel on foot. What's most important to take away, I think, though, is that it's really about a comprehensive, holistic approach. Adding more lights or creating women only bus stops and creating these segregated pathways, these things don't act in isolation. They help create a larger societal infrastructure that takes women's mobility and just their sheer existence in public spaces into account.
It's really interesting to note the point about how we need to have a more comprehensive approach. But now, as we consider the broader implications of mobility, it's obviously very essential for us to shift our focus to how we utilize these public spaces. So, this brings us to the concept of the right to city. So, what does this mean, and how does gender influence our understanding and experiences of public spaces?
I'm really glad you asked this question because the right to city is actually something that comes up a lot in my reading and in my writing and just in the general approach I take to research. And the right to city is a concept that basically advocates for equitable access to urban areas and spaces, regardless of gender, class, socioeconomic background, other intersectional factors that you can think of. However, for women, access to public spaces is often shaped by safety concerns, social norms, and urban design. So many women feel that they have what's called conditional access to the city, meaning they can use public spaces during the day, but must leave before nightfall or modify their behavior to fit into societal expectations. I'll give you an example from Australia. So, research from Melbourne, Australia revealed a concerning pattern where girls dramatically reduced their use of public parks and recreational spaces around the age of 12 to 13. So, sort of that early transitioning from girlhood to maybe adolescence. A notable study by the Victoria Health Promotion Foundation found that while boys continued to use these spaces throughout adolescence, girls' participation dropped by approximately 40%, which I think is a staggering percent during these transition to their teenage years. This decline stemmed from several interconnected factors: their rising concerns and awareness about personal safety and harassment, an increasing self-consciousness about physical activity in public and what kind of reactions they might get, and also just a lack of appropriate facilities that met their evolving interests, such as social gathering spaces rather than just sports fields. So the resulting gender gap in public space usage has significant implications for girls' physical health, social development, and just a general sense of belonging in their communities and in their cities that they inhabit.
And we've kind of realized at this point in time that urban planning to create inclusive spaces is quite a difficult challenge. And I wonder if there are any initiatives that have successfully tackled these challenges.
Yes, so the good news is that the tide is sort of turning. We're seeing that there's increased awareness of these challenges, and that there have been some initiatives to tackle them. So, for example, in the park I just mentioned in Australia, urban planners began responding to these findings by reimagining parks with features that specifically address these barriers and create more welcoming environments for teenage girls. And this could be as little as maybe having more public benches, so that girls have a space to sort of collect and sit around, and locating these benches in clear sight lines so they're not obstructed by trees. And also, in fact, even something as simple as labeling an exit clearly. Research has shown that when there is clear signage and a clear exit, women feel more comfortable to exist in these public spaces because they know in the case of an emergency, they know where to direct themselves and where to move themselves, which is, it's a sad thing that we need that, but it is something that gender responsive urban design should definitely take into consideration. And in the Indian context, several community driven initiatives and urban design strategies have actually made a difference. One example is the Step Out at Night campaign. This campaign is a women's safety initiative launched in Chennai, and it was created by the Chennai City Police in collaboration with the Social Welfare Department to address women's safety concerns in public spaces after dark specifically. So the campaign includes several key components, including regular night walks, even evening walks led by female police officers in different neighborhoods, the identification, mapping, and improvement of poorly lit areas with geospatial tech, increased CCTV cameras, increased police patrol areas in areas frequented by women at night, and a dedicated helpline for women traveling after dark. So this initiative aims to challenge the notion that women should not be out at night by providing support systems that make the nighttime navigation of the city safer. And since its launch, the campaign has expanded to several neighborhoods across Chennai and has inspired similar initiatives in other Indian cities, though at the moment, Chennai's program remains the most comprehensive and well-known implementation of this sort of holistic approach. I'll just talk briefly about another example, which is, I think, really great. It's called the Safety Pin app. And essentially, it enables users themselves and women and girls themselves who are commuting on a day-to-day basis to college, office, to conduct safety audits of public spaces by rating lighting, visibility, and security measures. Cities like Mumbai and Delhi have used data from Safety Pin to improve infrastructure and make these spaces more inclusive. And I think this is a really great example because it allows the people themselves who are commuting to sort of give their input. And I think that's sort of the point of this type of data, and it makes it much more informative when creating an initiative like this. In addition, the Women Walk at Midnight scheme in Bangalore has encouraged female-led walking groups to reclaim the night and demonstrate the importance of gender-sensitive urban planning. So I've talked a lot about community initiatives here, but I just want to stress that government policies are also extremely fundamental in shaping urban environments. In India, two key policies that drive gender-sensitive urban planning are the Smart Cities Mission and the National Urban Transport Policy. The Smart Cities mission promotes the use of technology and data-driven governance to improve urban living, and many cities under this initiative have introduced women-focused safety measures. For instance, Bhopal's Smart City initiative includes AI-monitored surveillance systems and emergency response mechanisms for public safety. The National Urban Transport Policy encourages cities to develop sustainable and inclusive transport systems with a focus on non-motorized transport, last mile connectivity in more rural areas, and pedestrian-friendly streets. These are all critical elements for women's mobility.
I think you've kind of helped us understand what the status quo is in terms of inclusive urban planning and initiatives to create more equitable urban spaces. But looking ahead, what are some emerging trends or innovative approaches in gender sensitive urban design that holds promise for cities in countries like India?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are several promising trends and innovative approaches in gender sensitive urban design that are sort of emerging and evolving that could reshape Indian cities for the future. And these developments build very strongly on existing efforts while introducing new technologies and frameworks. I have about 5 elements. I'm going to break each one down very briefly for you. So, the first one that's important is digital safety mapping and crowdsourcing data. We had talked just a little bit about collecting data before, but in more detail, urban planners are increasingly using mobile apps and digital platforms that allow women to report unsafe areas in real time, contribute to safety maps of neighborhoods, share the experiences of public spaces, and rate the quality of infrastructure. And the data collected helps create evidence-based design that respond to women's actual experiences rather than assumptions, perhaps. And cities like Bangalore and Delhi have piloted such initiatives with potential for wider adoption. So that's the first. The second that's important is gender responsive budgeting at the municipal level. So, more cities around the world are adopting gender responsive budgeting, or what we say call a shorthand GRB frameworks, that allocate specific percentages of municipal budgets to gender sensitive infrastructure. They require gender impact assessments for new urban projects, which is really important to do at the beginning of an urban development project, because it's really critical and imperative to start the project as you mean to go on and kind of embed this lens from the very beginning rather than perhaps at the end as sort of, just a checkbox to tick, perhaps. And these frameworks also create accountability mechanisms to track implementation, make sure goals are being met, and to involve women's civil society groups in the budget planning processes. And this approach, like I said, ensures that gender considerations are built into financial planning from the start. I think this is really, really important. The third that I want to talk about is integrated transportation and land use planning. So, future oriented approaches are moving beyond isolated interventions to create holistic systems that consider transit oriented development with women's needs in mind, mixed use zoning that reduces travel distances to essential services that women might need to access in their day to day life, first and last mile connectivity solutions specifically designed for women, and multimodal transportation systems that accommodate care work and sort of just give women maybe a few more options that take off the burden of having to think so much before they have to step out for the day. So that was the third one. I'll take you through the fourth one now, which is technology enhanced safety systems. New technological approaches, including smart lighting systems that respond to movement and usage patterns, emergency response buttons integrated into public infrastructure, AI powered camera systems designed with privacy protections, and navigated apps optimized for women's safety concerns are all things that we can really use to leverage India's sort of approach to gender responsive urban design. And finally, the fifth, and I think the most important in a country like India and in the Indian context, is intersectional approaches to urban design. Recognition is growing that gender interacts and sort of plays with other factors. Designs that consider needs of women across age groups, abilities, religions, and castes are becoming more prominent, with attention to specifically migrant women's urban challenges, focus on informal workers' needs in public space design, and the accommodation of cultural and religious practices in public infrastructure. And all of these things are important across Indian cities where sort of people from different areas mix and mingle. So this nuanced approach moves beyond treating women as a homogenous group, appreciates women's lived experiences, and recognizes the diversity of needs across different groups of urban women in India. We've talked a lot about international examples, and while we can take inspiration from them, it's very important to know that this is not sort of a copy and paste template that we can fit onto India. It's important to sort of take local and contextual considerations into mind. So those were the 5 factors I wanted to discuss briefly.
I think the 5 factors kind of fill me with hope in terms of what is there in the future for inclusive urban spaces. But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that it is important for it to be kind of customized to Indian cities. So, what specific recommendations could Indian cities use to create more inclusive urban environments?
Yes, so I think the key takeaway and that I want to leave you with, and sort of the 4 key recommendations to drive in, is definitely participatory design, and really thinking about what participation means, what representation means, and how urban planning can involve women at every stage of decision making. Cities like Pune have successfully conducted Mahila audits, where women assess urban spaces and provide feedback on their usability and safety. So I think scaling what works, because there are things that work. I think in this area, and when you hear a lot of these stories, it's very easy to take sort of a dismal approach to things and think this can never change. But in small steps, they really are. So focusing and zoning in on what has worked and replicating that on a wider scale is something that I think is important. The second is data-driven decision making. Policymakers must integrate gender disaggregated data into planning efforts. So, real time feedback, such as crowdsourced data from safety apps, can guide infrastructure investments more practically, I'd say. The third, as we discussed, is intersectional approaches. And the fourth is urban governance reform. I think cities must allocate specific budgets for gender sensitive projects and implement accountability frameworks to ensure policies translate into real change. And I think that sort of a mix of all these policies would drastically change what we see today as the urban landscape in India at the moment. I'd just like to take a moment to also say it's important to remember the change doesn't necessarily just come from policy interventions. It also comes from grassroots efforts. So, looking at how civil society and on the ground movements and public policy can all be conflated and sort of work together in unison is really important. So, supporting organizations like Jagori, a nonprofit that aims to create cities where the safety and mobility concerns of women is a really interesting thing to look into, as well as other organizations such as the Institute for Transportation and Development, which looks to create sustainable and equitable and holistic approaches to transport in cities, taking into account good land use, infrastructure, and amenities, particularly for the most vulnerable communities. Ultimately, urban transformation requires collaboration between governments, planners, communities, civil society, and technology innovators. And it really requires a combined effort from multiple stakeholders because it's a big change and a fundamental change to make. As we sort of near the end of this discussion and this podcast, I'd like to talk about an amazing book I've read recently. It's by 3 women, Shilpa Phadke, Samira Khan, and Shilpa Ranade, and it's called Why Loiter. It maps the exclusion and trade offs that women from different classes and communities encounter in India's urban public spaces and is informed by more than 3 years of primary on the ground research in the different locales of Mumbai. So the authors argue that even though women's access to urban public spaces has increased, they still cannot claim an equal right to taking up space in the city. And something that really resonated with me, and I think that something that resonates with a lot of women, is how they talk about the act of loitering as a celebration and as somewhat of a radical act, because women only seem to truly exist in public spaces when they have a purpose when they have somewhere to go, something to do, somewhere to be. They can never seem to exist in public spaces solely just for the purpose of existing, as compared to men who really do tend to exist more largely and loiter in these public spaces. And so, in this vein, I'd also like to read a quote from an article called In the Pursuit of Idleness, Women in Public Spaces by Urvi Desai, Ramya Ramesh, and Bhavin Shukla. And they write, for women, the notion of occupying the city, that is, to be able to spend some time there and dwell in it, is not an everyday practice of doing nothing, but one that always necessitates the consumption or production of an event, product, activity, or service. And this idea that women must always justify their presence in public spaces, that they can't simply exist without purpose, is at the heart of why gender-responsive urban design is so crucial and so necessary, I'd say. And I'd really say it's the need of the moment. So I'll stop there. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me, Aparna. It's been great to share this space with you and discuss what gender-responsive urban design could look like in India, and what steps we need to take to help women reclaim the right to roam. Thanks so much to our audience for listening in, and we hope you tune in for our next episode.
Thank you, Maya.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.